The third part of this presentation talks about other sources of information. There is some information in this presentation on SAE, the Society of Automotive Engineers, but there's also a little bit here in this particular section. Again, if you really want to understand the SAE material, that you probably want to look at the other video as well. So where do you find, what are other sources of information on standards? I had mentioned earlier this AID report. AID was a project in the EU that was carried out, and that document is listed here. You can Google it and find it. I have not listed the URL because it does change from time to time. But if you list this title and this deliverable number, you'll pretty much get to it. So it has a number of topics that are covered, in particular standards and EEC regulations that are relevant to this particular issue. So if you're looking for that, if you're interested in that topic, take a look. The European Statement of Principles has existed for some period of time, and it's had a major impact on the design of motor vehicles. There are 35 principles in there, and the key point about these principles is they are very high level, so it's actually quite difficult to design specifically to the principle. Let me give you some examples and then say how it's been taken farther. So for example, there's a section called High-Level Design Goals. There are 5 of them, and here's an example. The system supports the driver and does not give rise to potentially hazardous behavior by the driver and other users. Well, that seems simple and makes sense, but the question is, how do you actually do it? And so what has resulted is a number of other documents that take these principles and tries to take them and say, well, what does it actually mean? How do we do it? And how do we test it? So there are principles associated with installation. There are principles associated with visual presentation of information, which actually are some of the most important and widely cited principles. So for example, visually displayed information should be such that a driver can assimilate it within a few glances, which are brief enough. So what is a few glances? What is brief enough? And how do you make the assessment? And that's what the follow-on documents do. And here are just some examples of other topics. So there's principles of interaction with displays and controls. There are issues about system behavior and principles associated with that. And there are principles about information in the system. And again, I've given you an example of each principle to help you understand what's in each category. So the ultimate question is, well, how do you measure compliance with these principles? And that's where some of the activities of SAE comes in. And so here's a list of some of the SAE human factors standards that are relevant and something you should know about. SAE J2364 is something that I wrote. It's now stabilized, meaning there's no further work on it, but it still exists, and it talks about navigation, function, accessibility. Whoops. SAE J2365 talks about the calculation of how long it takes to complete tasks. It's identified as navigation tasks, but in fact it's basically any in-vehicle task that involves a visual display and manual controls. There are standards associated with message priority. I spoke about that earlier in terms of the ISO standard. There's also one in SAE. Here are the measurement ones. There's a number of standards associated with various systems: adaptive cruise control, forward collision warning, blind spot. The titles vary slightly, but they all focus on the user interface. There are also standards for lane departure, for how symbols should be tested, for text messages, not text messages on phone, but text messages shown to drivers, noise. I want to highlight SAE J2944, definitions of driving performance measures. Anybody doing research on driving should read that, because the problem is that terms are not defined or used consistently, and you need to make sure that you use and cite the official terms for response time, road departure, time to collision, and so forth. Wireless communication is actually a very short one. Speech input is a guideline that exists, but you'll find that it does not have very much content, and the user interface for lane keeping assistance systems. And then here's a few others that you need to know about. As of September of 2017, there was work on these particular standards, and the standards that I mentioned are periodically under review. So although I've listed dates of them, in the future those dates will change. It's not clear that the content will change substantially. So I want to just sort of wrap this portion on SAE materials by saying there's just a huge number of SAE documents. I've only covered a few of them. There's a handout associated with this video, and you will see a much more complete list of those standards that runs for many, many pages. There's just not time within the video to cover them all, but at least that you should have a sense of the kinds of things that are out there. Another organization that has a really important role in standards and driving safety is the U.S. Department of Transportation. They issue something called the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, commonly referred to as FMVSS. And what's in those standards are legal requirements for vehicles sold in the United States. If you don't meet the standards, it cannot be sold. ISO, SAE standards, and so forth are voluntary, but because of type compliance, meaning to import them into some countries, there's a requirement that the manufacturer meet the recognized standards, which includes SAE, ISO, and so forth, but in particular ISO. Then in some sense, those voluntary standards become requirements. In contrast to the other sources of information, U.S. DOT standards, Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards, are available online, and they're available for free. When the government develops a standard, they follow something called the Administrative Procedures Act. In many ways, it has some semblance to the way standards development organizations work, but there's some additional formalities. But in brief, there's a proposal that some agency has for a standard. It's published in something called the Federal Register, which is a document that has old-style telephone book size print and comes out daily. There's an announcement there. There's sometimes a preliminary proposal for what the standard might be. The government holds hearings, often in Washington, D.C. They may have a listening tour or hold hearings in other cities for motor vehicles. Given there's such a focus in Detroit, they may come to Detroit. And then if they do that, they may also go out to the West Coast, to California, for example, San Francisco, because there's a lot of technology people out there. They'll listen to what people say. They will then call at some point, either during that process or before or after, they'll call for public comment, and anybody, they don't have to be a technical expert, can comment on any item that's published in the Federal Register. The government agency then takes those comments, tries to respond to them, but they're not required to respond to every comment, but they attempt to respond to them and to use those comments to improve the document. It might be appear again in the Federal Register and go through a second or a third round, depending on the publication, and it can even be dropped. Here's some of the standards that exist for the topic that I'm focusing on. Standard 101, controls and displays, is most appropriate. But you can see there are other standards that pertain to the driver interface. Again, these are available online and for free. They tend to not be updated very often because the process of going through the Administrative Procedures Act and getting something to be a legal requirement is extremely burdensome. There's also a 200 series, and these are concerned mostly with crashworthiness. And again, you can go to the U.S. Department of Transportation. Here's the current URL for their website that lists regulations that are pertinent to motor vehicles. In addition, there's something called the New Car Assessment Program. And so this was an attempt to not get engaged in rulemaking, but to provide guidelines for the design of vehicle, or guidance, depending on sort of how you think about it. And so there are documents out there for forward collision warning, for lane departure warning, and for stability control. Finally, not only does the U.S. Department of Transportation have a new car assessment program, commonly referred to as NCAP, but Japan has one, and there's also one in Australia, and I assume over time there'll be other programs. So again, the idea is to focus more on guidance and less on regulation, but the essential question is, at what point does guidance from the government look like a push to do regulation? And so it doesn't have the enforcement power of law, but it does have the authority of the government behind it. So it tries to encourage manufacturers and suppliers to design safe vehicles without some of the formalities of requirements, because it just takes so long to get agreement on the exact language of requirements. There are also other things out there for visibility and so forth. So another topic of great interest is automated driving systems, and the U.S. Department of Transportation has tended to go a little bit more carefully on this. You're finding fewer guidelines, fewer rules, and the process is just slower because the technology is evolving so quickly. However, there is really a need to have good guidance, and we will see what happens over time as information evolves on this particular topic. And I've given you a link to a website that at least gets you to the press releases, and hopefully if you can get to the press releases, you might be able to find documents that are published well after this video is complete. So with that, I've talked about 3 different perspectives on automotive human factors guidelines, and hopefully it's been useful to you. Those of you that have additional questions should feel free to contact me at the University of Michigan Transportation Research Institute. I've provided my email address and the website for my team, which will have a lot of technical reports and journal articles and conference papers that you may find useful. I'd like to thank the National Institute of Standards and Technology for supporting the development of these materials that hopefully you'll find useful. Again, on the website of my team and on the NIST website, there should be both the PowerPoints that I've used for this presentation and the other reference materials that I've described. In addition, I'd like to thank Michigan Nexus from the College of Engineering for helping to produce these videos. These materials are not only for general purposes, but are intended to be adjuncts to classes that I teach at the University of Michigan, and in addition are supplemental materials for the Human Factors Engineering short course. This is a course that's taught for people in industry and government. It meets the last week in July and the first week of August every year, and we are now at the 60th year, and I assume we'll go well beyond that. So thank you for your attention. If you're interested in that course, I've provided the name of the course, the Human Factors Engineering short course. Just Google it or Google the Center of Ergonomics, and I'm sure you can find a link to the course. Over time, the website has changed, so that's not why I'm giving you the specific link. But if you Google it using this, you should be able to find it quite easily. Thank you for your attention.